in 2001, I was asked to make a film about a community of plantation workers, oil palm plantation workers living on the outskirts of, living about 60 miles actually from the city of Medan, where I made the act of killing. And they were struggling to organize a union, and I was asked to make a film documenting their struggle to organize a union in a place where unions had been illegal until just previously, until the fall of the Suharto dictatorship. This was 3 years afterwards. It turned out that that they desperately needed a union because the women workers were spraying a herbicide that was destroying their livers and killing them. And they were working for a big Belgian plantation company, and they needed to be able to have a union so they wouldn't have to poison themselves. And it turned out their biggest obstacle in organizing a union was fear. Fear because their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles had been in a union and had been accused in 1965 of being communist sympathizers just because they had been in a union, had been put in concentration camps by the army and then dispatched by the army to death squads to be killed. And they were afraid that having a new union, this could happen again. At the same time, they desperately needed a union. And as we started talking about the source of that fear, namely the 65 genocide, the mass killings, they started to send me on these really painful missions, if you like. I was asked to go and meet neighbors in the village who they knew had been somehow involved with the killings and hoped would have information about how their loved ones had died, because their relatives had been taken away and then disappeared, never came back. And they had never really been able to grieve or mourn what had happened because they didn't actually know that they didn't have proof and that their relatives had died, and they didn't have the closure that comes with proof. And so I would go on these missions and meet the perpetrators and find men who were, I was circumspect in my approach. I would arrive and I'd say, what did you do? I'd just introduce myself as someone living in the village. They would be curious, who's the foreigner in the village? They'd invite me in, offer me tea. Typically, they would, within moments of asking, what did you do for a living, they would tell me about the killings, and they would boast about it. I think this was because somehow the killings were the biggest thing they had done, and the key to whatever career they had afterwards. All of the human rights advocates with whom we met said, no, this is terribly important. You're onto something terribly important. They saw the boastful footage that I'd shot with these few perpetrators who I'd been sent to meet. They said, this is so important. We need a film that exposes, for Indonesians themselves, the nature of this regime. Not because Indonesians don't know it, but rather because they know it and are too afraid to talk about it. So they need a film that works a little bit like the child in The Emperor's New Clothes, that allows people to talk about what they've been too afraid to talk about and address problems they know are there but have been too afraid to address. So one of the survivors said, if it's too difficult to film with the survivors, if we're too vulnerable, it's too dangerous, why don't you film more perpetrators? Because you're finding out what happened. And when viewers see the nature of when they see them boasting, they'll understand why we're so afraid, and they'll understand the nature of the regime we're living under. So from that point, which was the beginning of 2004, I went and filmed every perpetrator I could find across the plantation belt of North Sumatra. I felt compelled to film them because I knew they knew what happened. We're talking about the murders of tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people. And as these men were growing old and as they would die, the facts of what had happened would be lost. And Anwar was the 41st perpetrator I met. And when I met him, I expected really, and filmed, and I expected really to make a film with a great many of these perpetrators I met from across the region, but there was something haunted about Anwar in the sense that when he told me on that rooftop the very first time I met him, when he told me what he had done, there was this sense that the past was present. Unlike many of the perpetrators who would sort of mechanically or boastfully tell me what he'd done, I could picture it. He was haunted, he was shadowed by the past was there, it was devastating. I remember dropping him off the very first time I filmed him at home and just breaking down in the car on the way home. And by then I'd filmed dozens of these guys, but I was really affected by him.
How are the people receiving it?
Yeah, I think there's a sense of anger among young people that we've been lied to in school, because they are lied to. The story justifying the killing is what's told. There's a sense of demanding that the government launch an official apology, and then a truth commission, a reconciliation process, and tribunals. It's much harder to oppress people who are not afraid. And the film has opened a space for people to talk about the problems of the present, because that's something I'd also emphasize. The Act of Killing is a film about now. Anwar, there's 2 musical numbers in the film. One of them is in the film, one of them we don't see. The one that's in the film is Born Free, and the other was to be a rendition of Anwar's very favorite song, which is Peggy Lee's Is That All There Is? It's a song about disappointment. If you think of it, is that all there is to a circus? Is that all there is to falling in love? And Anwar re-recorded that song and replaced the verses in the song with the spoken verses with anecdotes from his life. Is that all there is to killing? Is that all there is to starring in a movie? And when we were looking for a location for it, we were driving along this road, this winding mountain road, and turn a bend, and then there on the mountainside was this 4-story goldfish. And if you're filmmakers, you'll know at that moment you pull over and ask yourself, what is that and what can we do with that? And Anwar said immediately, that's so sad, it's so disappointing. It was once a beautiful creation, and now it's decayed, weathered, witnessing the world go by, and we should make that that's the perfect place for this scene. Here's this goldfish, this product of human fantasy, sitting there existing, persisting, not going away, witnessing the ongoing human folly. And we see these men lost in their fantasies. It's an allegory for me of how we all get lost in our stories, how we all create our reality through storytelling and use storytelling to run away from our most bitter and painful truths. The lake behind them is the single most important spot in our history as a species. That is Lake Toba. It's a crater lake. It erupted as a volcano. It was a supervolcano that erupted 50,000 years ago. And by that point, human beings, Homo sapiens, had already been on Earth for 950,000 years, more or less. And there were millions of us, and we were all over the planet. And the volcanic winter caused by the eruption of this supervolcano was so severe that it killed all of us, apart from a band of somewhere between 1 and 10,000 people living in isolation somewhere in the world. And the way we know this is that a geneticist can look at everybody in Manhattan and see that we all have only 50,000 years of evolutionary divergence between us, that we all have evolved from a single group, isolated group, 50,000 years ago. And when geologists look at what could have caused this mass, what's called an evolutionary bottleneck, we went through a bottleneck, it could only have been the Toba supervolcano. So that's called the Toba bottleneck. It's the Toba supercatastrophe. And in that sense, in a very real sense, in the final shot there, they are dancing a danse macabre at the very edge of the abyss.